The Salt-Stained Hymnal, Chapter 3, The Unblemished Water. The air in the repurposed reclamation hub tasted of nothing. That was the point. An ozone generator, scavenged from a pre-deluge medical facility, hummed a clean, sharp counterpoint to the city's deep, wet groan. Outside this pressurized plastic bubble, the gill racks wept a perpetual drizzle of rust and contaminants. Inside, Joric Kantor had created a pocket of sterile, structured sanity. He adjusted the magnification on his field microscope, the machined click of the dial a small, satisfying sound of order. On the slide beneath, a filament of sickly green mold, Aspergillus viridis benthos, the most common rot in these mid-levels, lay inert under the harsh LED glare. Mundane. Predictable. He'd seen it 1,000 times. He keyed his observations into a waterproof data slate, his fingers moving with practiced efficiency. Subject: Gamma 9. Fungal sample 07A. Source: rusted vent grate. Residential Hab 412 Beta. Analysis: no anomalous morphology. No detectable hallucinogenic alkaloids. Pathogenicity: consistent with standard respiratory irritants. Conclusion: benign. He leaned back, the synth leather of his chair creaking. Benign. Everything he had cultured from the Gamma 9 flood zone so far was depressingly, infuriatingly benign. Yet the whispering sickness spread. It flowed through the gill racks faster than the rising, spore-choked water itself. A pathogen of the mind, then. Far easier to cure. The door to his sterile field lab hissed open, and a BCA enforcer, helmet fogged with condensation, guided in a thin, shivering woman. Her name was Anya. Joric had her file on his slate. Age, 43. Algae paste processor. Husband lost to a structural collapse 2 years ago. Stay dry, the enforcer granted, before sealing the door, leaving Joric alone with his new specimen. Please, have a seat, Joric said, his voice calm and level. The voice of a doctor, a confessor, a man who dealt only in fact. He gestured to a polymer stool bolted to the floor. She sat, clutching a threadbare shawl around her shoulders, her eyes wide and scanning the sterile white walls as if looking for a way out. They said you wanted to ask about the hymn, she whispered, her voice rough. I want to ask about your symptoms, Joric corrected gently. Tell me what you've experienced. Begin with the first instance.
It wasn't a symptom, her gaze fixed on the microscope, on the small point of light. It was a gift. The drips, you know how you can hear the drip-cant? The warnings? Joric nodded. This was different. Underneath it, a sound like 100 voices humming one note. The right note, the one that makes the bones in your chest feel warm. Joric typed, auditory hallucination, low frequency, reports of somatic sensation. And what did this hymn say to you? He asked, not looking up from his slate. It doesn't use words, not at first. It just knows. It knew I missed Ren. A tear traced a clean path through the grime on her cheek. And then I heard him, clear as you are now. He told me he wasn't in the cold dark. He was waiting. He said the salt can't hold us forever. He said we'll all be together in the bloom. Vocal hallucination manifesting as a deceased loved one. Classic grief-induced pareidolia, exacerbated by mycotoxin exposure. Did you see anything? Light, she said, her voice gaining a fervent edge. Not the orange emergency lights or the sick green of the rot. A real light, blue and white, like the sky we see on the old slates. It pulsed with the hymn. I saw the walls of my hab. They weren't weeping rust. They were breathing, growing with soft, glowing moss that purified the air. Joric paused his typing. He looked at her, truly looked, at the dilated pupils, the faint tremor in her hands. She wasn't lying. She was experiencing this. The subjective reality was absolute to her. That was the nature of the disease. It didn't just show you things, it made you believe. "Thank you, Anya. That's very helpful," he said, his tone unchanged. He pressed a button on his console. The door hissed open. The enforcer took her arm. "You have to believe me," she pleaded, looking back at Joric, her face a mask of desperate hope. "It's not a sickness, it's a promise." He watched her go, then turned back to his slate and added a final note. "Subject exhibits advanced delusion and religious ecstasy. Recommends quarantine and a standard antipsychotic regimen."
He let out a long, controlled breath. It was always the same story. Desperate people living in a metal tomb, breathing poison, eating slime, find a new reason to hope. And hope was the most virulent pathogen of all. You couldn't culture it, couldn't kill it with UV light. You could only excise the host. A few hours and 2 more interviews bled into one another. A jumpy teenager who swore a chorus of angels taught him how to patch a leaky water pipe. An old man who claimed the whispers soothed the ache in his joints. Textbook mass psychogenic illness. The stress of the flood, the contaminated air, the constant grinding despair. It was a perfect petri dish for a faith-based contagion. His disdain was a cold, comfortable weight in his gut. This was simple. This was solvable. His frustration was with the samples. He ran another air quality test, the machine whirring dutifully. Negative for any known psychoactives. He sequenced the DNA of another fungal smear. Nothing but common, harmless decay. It was like trying to find the source of a tidal wave by analyzing a single drop of water. The answer wasn't in the biology. Not yet. His comm unit chimed. It was Kalen Rask's secure channel. Joric ignored it. He didn't need the military bluntness clouding his process. The last interviewee of the cycle was a man named Tegan, a sump diver's apprentice with the telltale pallor of someone who spent too much time in the lower levels. He didn't sit, he stood, his energy a stark contrast to the other's exhaustion. "You're the debunker," Tegan said. It wasn't a question. "The pure from the airy, come to tell us we're crazy." "I'm a theologian," Joric replied coolly. "I'm here to identify the source of a widespread neurocognitive event." Tegan laughed, a short, sharp bark. "Salt rot you are. You call it a neurocognitive event. We call it the Word. You see a sickness. We see a God who lives where we live, in the damp, in the dark. A God who understands that rot is just another kind of life." "A God that offers hallucinations as salvation?" Joric countered, leaning forward. His clinical patience was wearing thin. "It offers more than that," Tegan said, his voice dropping, becoming intense. "It offers connection. You know what it's like, to be truly known, To have every broken piece of you held by 1,000 others? To share a single breath, a single thought? Up in your sterile sky towers, you pures, you've forgotten what it is to not be alone. Joric felt an involuntary clench in his stomach. The words were a mimicry of theological concepts he'd studied for decades. Kenosis, theosis, the dissolution of the self into the divine, a cheap, fungal knockoff of a forgotten faith. The self is all we have, Tegan. Giving it away isn't salvation, it's extinction. You're wrong, the diver said, a pitying look on his face. You hear the whispers too, don't you? I can see it, but you're fighting them. You're trying to put God under your microscope. He tapped the plexiglass wall, his finger leaving a smudge on Joric's clean world. He's not in there, theologian. He's out here. He's in the water, and he's giving a sermon. You should go listen. Before Joric could reply, the diver turned and rapped on the door to be let out. Joric was left in the humming silence. His confidence, so solid just hours before, now felt brittle. The diver's words had unsettled him more than the hysterical ramblings. You hear the whispers too, don't you? A lie. A probe. And yet, for a fleeting moment, under the hum of the ozone generator, he thought he could hear something else, a faint, harmonic resonance, like a child's laughter echoing from a great distance. He squeezed his eyes shut. Leah. He shook his head, the motion sharp and angry. No. It was auditory pareidolia. His mind, under stress, was creating patterns from random noise. A symptom, nothing more. But the weariness was profound, a frustration deeper than a failed experiment. He had come down here to dissect a superstition, and found a mirror. The desperate, hopeful faces of the infected reflected his own desperate, nihilistic certainty. Both were articles of faith. He looked at his hands, clean and steady. He was Joric Kantor. He was a scientist. He dealt in evidence, and the evidence was telling him nothing at all. The lab was a lie, a sterile white polymer bubble of airy arrogance, hastily assembled in a repurposed docking control room. Outside its sealed door, the gill racks wept, the constant drip of corrosive condensation a metronome for the city's slow decay. Inside, the air scrubbers fought a losing battle, their ozone tang barely masking the sweet, cloying scent of honey and rot that emanated from the petri dish under Joric's microscope. It was the perfume of God, he thought, a scent that promised paradise and delivered only dissolution. He leaned away from the eyepiece. The magnified image of the murmuration's mycelial network still burned onto his retinas. It wasn't just a fungus, it was architecture. The hyphae didn't just grow, they wove themselves into intricate recursive patterns that mimicked neural pathways. It was unnervingly beautiful, a filigree of sickly green-gold light pulsing with a rhythm that felt disturbingly familiar, like a half-remembered song. He rubbed his temples, a dull ache throbbing in time with the city's deep, hydraulic heartbeat. He hadn't slept. Not really. Sleep offered no escape, only a different kind of immersion. Dreams of his daughter, Anya, her face pale under a sky the color of rust, her small hand slipping from his as the water rose. A sharp, three-note chime sliced through the low hum of the lab. High priority, encrypted. Joric didn't have to check the caller ID. Only one person used that channel to reach him. Salt rot, he muttered, straightening his stained lab coat. He tapped the console, and the air above the central holo emitter shimmered, coalescing into a pillar of harsh blue light. From it, the form of Commander Kalen Rask solidified, perfect and unnaturally crisp against the grimy, weeping walls of the lab. His BCA uniform was immaculate, the creases sharp enough to cut. Not a drop of the city's pervasive dampness clung to him. He was a creature of the airy, pure and sterile, and he looked at Joric's world as if it were a smear of mold to be scoured away. "Report, Kantor," Rask said. His voice was flat and hard as his gaze, devoid of warmth or preamble. It was the voice of structured survivalism itself. Joric gestured vaguely at the microscope. "Analysis is ongoing. The organism is more complex than preliminary scans suggested. It exhibits communicative properties, a coordinated bioluminescence that responds to stimuli."
Rask's expression didn't flicker. It was a mask of professional impatience. "I don't pay you for academic curiosity. The situation in Gamma 9 is degrading. The pump failure is irreversible. That entire sector is becoming a damned petri dish. I need a target." "A target," Joric repeated, the words tasting like metal. He knew what Rask meant. He always meant the same thing. "The vector, Kantor, the biological source, the sporing body. Find the heart of this infection so I can authorize a purity sweep and burn it out. My teams are on standby, but my mandate requires a quantifiable biological threat assessment. Your assessment. Give me a reason to cleanse them." There it was. Cleanse. The BCA's preferred euphemism for fire, for boiling the desperate and the deluded in their own cramped HAB units with plasma casters. Joric felt a familiar cold knot tighten in his gut. He was the tool that sharpened the axe. "Commander, a full-spectrum fungicide or thermal sterilization on that scale," Joric began, his voice deliberately clinical, a shield against the images spooling in his mind. "The collateral damage to the sector's water reclamation pipes and structural supports would be catastrophic. You'd be trading a manageable cult for a district-wide collapse." "Your concern for infrastructure is noted," Rask said, the hologram speakers lending his voice an extra layer of metallic scorn. "But the whispering sickness is not manageable. It's a mimetic virus with a biological payload. Every hour, more damps abandon their pump maintenance shifts to go sing hymns in the dark. They're a threat to the system, to the very machinery that keeps this city from imploding. I will not let a fairy tale about a singing fungus throttle the heartbeat." Joric held the man's unwavering gaze. It was like looking at a machine. No empathy, just calculations. A system to be maintained, no matter the cost in individual lives. Rask's god wasn't a fungus. It was the groaning, failing machine of Benthos itself, a far more demanding and less benevolent deity. "My job is to investigate, identify, and debunk," Joric stated, his own voice hardening. "To prove their god is a pathogen, that requires methodical procedure. Rushing to sterilization based on incomplete data is not procedure. It's panic."
A flicker of something, raw, potent annoyance, finally broke through Rask's composure. "This is a contract, Kantor, not a research grant. Your unique theological expertise was procured for one purpose: to give me the scientific justification to eliminate this problem. You are a tool, nothing more. Do you understand?" Joric felt a phantom itch behind his eyes. For a split second, Rask's crisp holographic face seemed to blur, replaced by the memory of his wife's face, tight with worry, as the storm sirens began to wail all those years ago. He blinked, and the illusion was gone.
Rask was still there, a ghost of cold logic haunting his lab. The headache intensified. I understand that you want a quick, tidy solution for a problem that is neither, Joric said, his professional annoyance solidifying into something colder, harder, a resolve. You want me to find the source? I will, but I will do it my way. I need to get into Gamma 9, on the ground. My remote drones can't get an accurate spore density reading through the structural interference. Rask was silent for a long moment. The only sound was the hum of the emitter and the incessant, maddening drip from the ceiling. A drop of rust-colored water slid down the wall behind the hologram, a single tear on the face of the decaying city. Fine, the commander finally clipped out. You have one cycle. After that, my purity teams go in regardless of your findings. I will not lose a whole sector to sporeheads and their imaginary friend. He didn't wait for a reply. He made a minute gesture off camera, and his image dissolved in a cascade of blue pixels and a sharp hiss of ozone. The lab was plunged back into the dim, greasy orange of its emergency lighting. Silence descended, heavy and humid. The drip, drip, drip seemed louder now, more insistent. Joric stood motionless, his own reflection a ghostly stranger in the dark screen of the hollow emitter. He had his mandate, find the monster's heart. But Rask was wrong. This wasn't about saving the city. For Joric, it had never been about that. It was about proving that the universe was as empty and meaningless as it felt the day he lost everything. It was about looking into the heart of this new god and finding nothing there but a mindless biological process, an infection, a lie.
He turned back to the microscope, the ache in his head a cold, steady presence. He would find the source, and he would cut it out. Not for the BCA, and not for Kalen Rask, for himself. He had to. The demarcation was a line of rust-stained polymer, the last clean surface before the rot began. Joric planted his boots on the top rung of the service ladder, the metal biting into the worn soles. Above, the filtered, logical world of the mid-level transit nexus hummed with sterile efficiency. Below was the throat of Benthos. He sealed his rebreather, the hiss and click of familiar comfort. A final check of the seals, a glance at the air purity light, a reassuring solid green. His gear was airy grade, the best cows could buy, a necessary expense. The pathogens in the lower levels were as varied as they were lethal, and this new faith, this murmuration, was just the latest addition to the city's microbial bestiary. Or so he kept telling himself. His gloved hands closed around the ladder's side rails. The metal was cold, slick with a film of perpetual condensation. He began to descend. Rung by rung, he left the ordered world behind. The uniform hum of the transit hub faded, replaced by the deeper, more resonant thrum of the city's heartbeat, the colossal pumps that kept Benthos from its final, gurgling death. And with it, another sound began to assert itself. The drip. A slow, metronomic clock counting down the seconds of the city's life, each drop echoing in the vast vertical space. 10 meters down, and the air changed. The sterile ozone tang of the upper-level scrubbers thinned, replaced by something heavier, something organic. A sweetness layered over the metallic damp of decay,
like nectar spilled on a corpse. He recognized the signature from lab samples, the sweet rot of the murmuration. His wrist slate's atmospheric sensor confirmed it, the spore count ticking up from 0 into the low double digits. Negligible for now. He'd breathed worse on other contracts.
30 meters. The emergency lighting grew sparse, long stretches of darkness now separating the sickly orange cones of light. In these moments of near total blackness, his other senses sharpened. The groan of a support beam somewhere to his left, a long, agonized sound of metal fatigue, the scuttling of unseen things in the walls, the smell. That sweet, cloying scent was stronger now, threading its way past the rebreather's seals, a phantom on the edge of his perception, like honey in grave soil. He paused, clinging to the ladder, and activated the broad-spectrum lamp on his shoulder harness. The beam cut a stark white tunnel through the oppressive humidity, and there it was, his first clear sighting. A web of faint green light traced the seams of a corroded conduit pipe, not the harsh orange of failing emergency systems, but a living luminescence. Veins of it pulsed, a slow, greasy rhythm in time with the city's deep hum. Cordyceps benthos variant 7, his mind supplied, a clinical label for a thing that felt profoundly unclinical. It was intricate, almost beautiful in a horrifying, cancerous way. He killed the light, plunging back into the orange-dusted dark. Better not to look too closely. Better to keep it abstract, a pathogen to be analyzed, not a presence to be felt. His foot slipped on a patch of slimy biofilm. He caught himself with a jolt, his gear clanking against the ladder. Salt rot. 50 meters down, the ladder ended. He swung himself onto a narrow catwalk that stretched out into the chasm. It swayed under his weight, a long metallic sigh echoing into the void below. He froze, knuckles white on the pitted railing. Far below, scattered lights swam in the gloom like malevolent stars in a drowned sky. Hab units welded to the city's bones, makeshift bridges, the faint shimmer of more fungal blooms. This was the true benthos. Not the sterile towers and sky bridges of the Eyrie, but this vertical graveyard, held together by rust and prayer. His own brand of prayer, anyway, the cold conviction that none of it mattered.
He forced himself to move, one careful step at a time. The grated floor of the catwalk was slick, and in places the rust had eaten clean through, leaving gaping holes that offered a direct view to the abyss. The dripping was louder here, a complex symphony of different rhythms and tones. He remembered reading about the Gilrack's drip-cant, a language of falling water, a primitive adaptation to an impossible environment. He filed the thought away. Sociological data point. Detachment was a tool, his most vital one. Another 10-meter walk brought him to a junction, a wider platform where several catwalks converged around a massive weeping support column. The air was thick enough to taste, sweet and heavy on his tongue even through the filter. The fungus was no longer just a creeping tracery on the walls. It grew in baroque, floral clusters, like ghostly orchids blooming from the steel. Their sickly green-blue light cast shifting, unreliable shadows. The spore count on his slate was now in the triple digits, the number glowing amber. His rebreather could handle it, but the constant exposure was a risk. A low-grade infection could compromise his judgment long before it showed physical symptoms. He stopped, scanning the junction. There were signs of recent passage, scuff marks on the rust, a freshly discarded nutrient paste wrapper. The damps lived their lives on these precarious ledges, a whole society crammed into the city's arteries. He was an intruder here, a pure from the sterile heights, and his presence would not be unnoticed for long. Then he saw it. Tucked into an alcove where a service panel had long since fallen away, a fungal growth had taken a different shape. It wasn't the veined lattice or the floral bloom. It was a dense mycelial mass that had formed a smooth, pale curve. Two curves, side by side. The size and shape, it mimicked with unnerving precision the gentle slope of a child's shoulders, as if the fungus was remembering a form or trying to build one. He felt a sudden sharp coldness that had nothing to do with the damp air. He thought of Anya, the way her shoulders felt under his hands when he lifted her onto the seawall all those years ago, before the water came for them.
He shook his head, the motion sharp and angry. It was a coincidental pattern, a trick of the low light and pareidolia, his brain trying to find order in the chaos. The spores weren't just in the air, they were a psychological agent. He knew that. He had to remember that. His clinical observation felt flimsy now, a thin sheet of polymer over a roiling sea of unease. He looked down, past the junction, following the path of a thick armored cable that snaked deeper into the gill racks. Cistern Gamma 9 Beta was still 100 meters below, 100 more meters of this. He took a steadying breath, the rebreather hissing in protest at the sudden intake. He was no longer just descending into a district. He was entering the organism's lungs. The air in the service conduit was thick enough to drink. It coated the back of Joric's throat with the taste of rust and ozone, a metallic tang that clung to his teeth. He moved with the stiff caution of an airy pure, his boots finding uncertain purchase on the graded catwalk. Below the mesh, black water lapped silently at unseen walls. To his left, the curved, sweating flank of the tunnel pressed close, weeping a greasy film of condensation. To his right, a row of colossal pressure pipes, arteries of bentos pulsed with the city's faint, low-frequency heartbeat. His guide, Moro, moved ahead of him, a lean silhouette against the sickly orange emergency light 50 meters down the corridor. She moved with a sump diver's economy of motion, her steps silent on the metal, her presence a ripple in the stagnant air. "Stay on the spine of the walkway," she called back, her voice a flat echo that the dampness couldn't quite kill. "Some of these plates are salt-rotted. One bad step and you're taking a swim in 50 years of industrial runoff." Joric grunted an acknowledgement, his gaze tracing the veins of rust that spiderwebbed across the nearest pipe. It was a leviathan, easily 2 meters in diameter, its surface pitted and scarred. Patches of a pale, phosphorescent lichen, an early non-sentient precursor to the murmuration his mind supplied clinically, pulsed with a faint, greasy green light. He catalogued it all with practiced detachment. This was just another decaying part of a dying machine, data to be observed, not felt. Then came the sound. It wasn't part of the city's usual symphony of decay, not the metronomic drip of water, or the groaning sigh of stressed support beams. This was a deeper noise, a resonant baritone groan that seemed to come from the very bones of the pipe beside him. It vibrated through the soles of his boots, a low thrum that felt disturbingly organic. He stopped. What was that? Moro paused, turning just her head. Her face was half in shadow, half in the orange glare. "That's the city talking. She's old, her bones ache. Keep moving." "That wasn't structural stress," Joric countered, his voice sharp with the arrogance of the academy. "That was a harmonic tremor. Consistent frequency. Something is putting that pipe under extreme cyclical pressure." Morrow finally turned her whole body to face him. He could see the glint of her eyes, unimpressed. "My apologies, Professor. I'll be sure to log it in my report. Now, unless your cyclical pressure is going to get us to the cistern any faster, move your ass." She turned and continued, but Joric remained, his hand hovering near the cold, sweating nettle of the pipe. The groan came again, louder this time. It was a long, deep-throated sound, like a whale dying in an ocean of steel. He could see the thousands of rivets studding its length, each one weeping a tiny dark tear of corroded fluid. He imagined the pressure inside. Millions of liters of unprocessed, spore-saturated water being forced from the bloom deeps towards a filtration junction that was probably just as decayed as this tunnel. A new smell joined the chorus of rot and ozone. It was sweet, cloyingly, unnaturally sweet. The smell of honeyed decay he'd come to associate with high concentrations of murmuration spores. He checked the portable atmospheric sensor on his wrist. The particulate count was climbing. Not just climbing, spiking. "Morrow," he said, his voice tight. "We have a containment breach somewhere. The spore count is—" He was cut off by a high-pitched whine. It was the sound of metal screaming, of rivets surrendering a fight they'd been losing for a century. A hairline fracture appeared on the pipe's surface, a dark line that instantly bled a misty vapor that shimmered with bioluminescence. "Kantor, get back!" Morrow yelled, already flattened against the far wall. But Joric was frozen, transfixed, a scientist watching the inevitable, beautiful failure of a system. The fracture spiderwebbed, a map of catastrophe drawn in a split second. The groaning dropped into an impossibly low frequency, a sound that bypassed his ears and simply existed in his chest cavity. He saw the metal bulge, the colossal pipe seeming to draw a final, shuddering breath. Then the ruptured mane of benthos let go. The explosion was not a bang, it was a physical blow. A solid wall of water moving with the force of a hydraulic press erupted from the side of the pipe. Joric had no time to even raise his arms. The blast caught him square in the chest, a brutal, cold impact that felt like being hit by a freight hauler. The air was punched from his lungs in a single violent gasp. He was airborne for a moment, a rag doll in a tempest, before he was slammed against the concrete tunnel wall with a sickening crack of his head against the wet stone. The world dissolved into a roaring, churning chaos of sound and pressure. Water filled his eyes, his ears, his open mouth. He tried to inhale, a primal, thoughtless instinct. It was a catastrophic mistake. What rushed into his lungs was not air. It was a thick, viscous slurry of water and something else, something particulate, almost alive. It was the cloying sweetness of rot, weaponized. He gagged, his body convulsing as he choked on the very contagion he had come to debunk. The taste was vile and divine, like grave soil and nectar. In the churning dark water that enveloped him, he saw them. Billions of tiny shimmering spores, each one a pinpoint of sickly green light, a galaxy of infection swirling around him, inside him. His head throbbed, a dull impact blossoming into white-hot pain. The roaring in his ears began to subside, replaced by a strange, high-frequency hum. The pressure lessened as the initial blast wave passed, leaving him slumped at the base of the wall while a torrent of foul water rushed past his legs. He coughed, heaving, spitting out a mouthful of the shimmering fluid onto the grated floor. It glowed faintly before being swept away. Morrow was there, grabbing the front of his jacket, hauling him to his feet. "Up! Get up, Salt Rotted! The whole tunnel's gonna flood!" Her words were distant, distorted. Joric could barely stand. His limbs felt heavy, his thoughts sluggish. The world seemed to be moving too slowly, coated in a strange, dreamlike varnish. He looked down at his hands. They were trembling. A thin film of the water coated his skin, and within it the tiny spores pulsed with their soft, insidious light. They weren't just on him. He could feel them. Inside. He could feel them moving in his blood, a microscopic pilgrimage through his veins. He felt a sudden profound cold that had nothing to do with the water. He took a ragged, burning breath, and the sweet smell was no longer just in the air. It was the scent of his own lungs. The hymn had been delivered. The seed had been planted in the most intimate way imaginable. He was no longer the forensic theologian studying a pathogen. He was the soil. The maintenance hatch slammed shut behind them, the clang of rusted metal echoing down the cylindrical tunnel. A final percussive punctuation to Kalen's broadcasted decree. Sump tainted. The word was a branding iron, a death sentence delivered over public address. Morrow grabbed his arm, her grip wiry and strong, pulling him forward into the oppressive dark. "Move, Kantor, now! They'll have sentinels at every junction in minutes." Joric stumbled, his boots splashing in the ankle-deep viscous fluid that coated the grated floor. The air was thick, a cocktail of ozone from a nearby power conduit, the metallic tang of decay, and that sweet, insidious scent of fungal bloom, like honey left to rot. His heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic, trapped bird. His mind, usually a fortress of cold logic and clinical observation, was a maelstrom. Sump-tunted. He was one of them now. One of the desperate creatures he was sent to dissect and debunk. He tried to focus, to compartmentalize. Fact, Kalen had declared him an enemy. Fact, Morrow was his only chance of survival. Fact, the spores from the cistern event were metabolizing in his system, a ticking clock of altered perception. He could feel them, a faint electric fizz behind his eyes, a warmth spreading through his chest that had nothing to do with the exertion of their escape. "This way," Morrow hissed, her voice tight. "There's a pressure equalizer that vents into the lower gill racks. It's a straight drop, but it's better than a purity squad." Joric nodded, but the motion felt disconnected, as if he were piloting his body from a great distance. The single beam from Morrow's headlamp sliced through the darkness, illuminating a weeping wall of corroded iron plates, each rivet head a weeping orange eye of rust. The low-frequency hum of the city's heartbeat vibrated up through the soles of his boots. Drip, 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 the metronome of benthos. But then the rhythm faltered. The world tilted. The groan of the city's superstructure seemed to stretch, to bend into a low, mournful note. The tunnel around him dissolved, its greasy walls melting away not into blackness, but into a profound and absolute void. The sound ceased. The smells vanished. The pressure of the humid air on his skin was gone. There was no up, no down, only a silent, weightless suspension. He wasn't falling, he just was. Hypoxia, his clinical mind supplied, a ghost in the machine. Sympathetic neural cascade from the spore exposure. Hallucinatory fugue state, The terms were anchors, familiar stones in a world that had turned to water. But the anchors were slipping. Something else was here, in the nothingness. A scent. Not rot, not ozone. Salt. Clean, cold, impossible salt. The ghost scent of the pre-deluge oceans, a memory he only knew from archival data slates. And with the scent came a sound. A drip. Not the metallic echo of the tunnel, but a soft, organic patter, like rain on pavement, or water dripping from a small hand. Then he saw her. A silhouette at first, impossibly small against the endless non-space. She was just there. As his eyes adjusted to a light that had no source, details sharpened with terrifying clarity. It was Anya, his daughter. His breath caught, a dry, painful hitch in his throat. He tried to speak her name, but it was a forbidden word, a shard of glass in his memory he dared not touch. The sound died before it could form. She wasn't a memory. She was real, horrifically, perfectly real. She wore the little blue jumper he'd bought her for her 7th birthday. It was soaked through, clinging to her thin, shivering frame. Her dark hair was plastered to her pale forehead, dripping steadily onto the unseen floor at her feet, each drop landing with that soft, heartbreaking patter. Her lips were the color of a benthos twilight, a bruised purple gray. She was so cold, so terribly cold.
"This is not real," he screamed inside his own head. "This is a weaponized hallucination. The fungus is accessing memory, repurposing trauma. It's a biological process. Analyze it, deconstruct it." He took a step, a leaden, dream-like movement. The void offered no resistance. She didn't move. She just watched him, her eyes wide and dark and empty. They weren't angry. They weren't sad. They were hollow. The eyes of someone who had waited a very, very long time in the dark. Anya. The name was a crack in his soul, finally escaping into the silence. He reached out a trembling hand. He needed to touch her, to feel the cold of her skin and prove to himself she was just a phantom, a complex chemical reaction. If he could just touch her, the illusion would shatter. It had to. She took a tiny step back, just out of his reach. The movement was fluid, real, a small, almost imperceptible shake of her head. The shivering intensified, her small shoulders trembling violently under the wet fabric of her jumper. He could feel the cold radiating from her, a palpable aura that sank into his bones. "It knows," a part of him whispered in terror. "The murmuration! It knows what I fear most. Not death, not pain. This." The cold logic of the forensic theologian was gone, burned away by the salt scent of his failure. All that remained was the father, the man who had been there, the man whose hand had slipped. He stopped, his arms still outstretched. He could see the water pooling around her bare feet. He could see the goosebumps on her arms. He could see the way her small chest hitched with each cold, shuddering breath. It was all so perfect, a masterpiece of psychological torture tailored just for him. There was a long pause. The silence stretched, filled only by the sound of dripping water and the frantic, silent screaming of his own mind. Then she spoke. Her voice was not a memory. It was here. A small,
quiet thing, thin and fragile, yet it struck him with the force of a structural collapse. It was a simple question, holding the weight of 82 years of grief. "Why did you let go, Daddy?" The words didn't accuse, they didn't rage, they simply asked. And in that question was the core of his personal hell, the breaking point of his universe, the moment his faith, his hope, his entire world had been torn from his grasp by the black, churning water of the deluge. He had no answer. He could only stare, his face a mask of utter devastation as the last of his defenses crumbled to dust. Anya held his gaze for a moment longer, her hollow eyes boring into him. Then the horror intensified. She didn't fade away, she dissolved. Her form began to break apart, her skin flaking away not as flesh, but as a cloud of shimmering, sickly green bioluminescent particles, the spores. The water at her feet swirled and darkened, becoming the greasy, chemical-sheened muck of the tunnel. Her shivering form collapsed inward, a beautiful, terrible implosion of light and memory. The clean scent of salt was choked out by the cloying, sweet perfume of the murmuration. His daughter, his most sacred memory, had become the very plague he was trying to destroy. The void collapsed. The sound of the tunnel rushed back in, the hum, the drip, Morrow's frantic, muffled voice. The grated metal floor was suddenly brutally solid against his cheek. He was on his hands and knees, choking on the foul air. A noise was tearing its way out of his throat, a sound he didn't recognize. It was raw, animal, a single sustained note of absolute agony. Joric! Kantor salt-rotted! Get up! Mara was shaking his shoulder, her face a pale oval of alarm in the bouncing beam of her headlamp. "What is it? What's wrong with you?" He couldn't answer. He could only gasp for air, his body racked with tremors that had nothing to do with the cold. The vision was gone, but the question remained, branded onto his mind. It echoed in the dark, a silent hymn sung just for him, in the voice of his drowned daughter. The world returned as a gasp, a raw, tearing inhalation that tasted of ozone and bile. Cold, grated metal pressed a sharp lattice pattern into Joric's cheek. Every joint in his body was a hot coal of pain, his skull a ringing bell. Below him, somewhere in the chasm the maintenance tunnel overlooked, the city's heartbeat pump thrummed its deep metronomic pulse, a sound so constant he usually filtered it out. Now it was a hammer against his sanity. Her face. The memory was a chemical burn on his mind's eye, not a soft, faded photograph from before the deluge, but vivid, present, Ilara. Her pale hair plastered to her small face by a phantom rain. Her eyes, the color of the sky he could barely remember, wide with a question he could never answer. "Kantor, Davis, Billington, Alice, and Ruffton, what is all this?"
"No," he rasped, the word a dry scrape in his throat. The sound was swallowed by the oppressive damp. A rhythmic drip, drip, drip from a corroded pipe nearby counted the seconds of his failure. His hands, they were shaking. Not a tremor, but a violent, uncontrollable quake, as if his own nerves were staging a rebellion. He pushed himself up, his muscles screaming. His gear dug into his ribs. The orange beam of his headlamp cut a frantic, jerking path across the opposite wall, illuminating a tapestry of greasy blue fungal slime and weeping rust stains. The air was thick, a fluid he had to force into his lungs. It smelled of wet metal, and underneath it all, that sweet, cloying scent, honey and rot.
The hymn of the murmuration. It wasn't real. It was a chemical assault, a pathogen's trick. He had to prove it. The need was a physical imperative, more urgent than the pain or the fear. Control was the only antidote to this poison. Data was the only prayer a man like him had left. Stumbling to his pack, he fumbled with the clasps, his trembling fingers betraying him. The simple mechanism felt like an impossible puzzle. Salt rot, he spat, finally tearing the flap open. He pulled out his field analysis kit and the small wrist-mounted recorder. His knuckles were white. He could still feel the phantom weight of a small hand in his, a ghost sensation that made his stomach clench. He jabbed the activation stud on the recorder. A small green light blinked to life. "Forensic theologian Joric Kantor," he began, his voice a ragged stranger's. He cleared his throat, forcing the shaking out of his words, trying to build a wall of clinical detachment, brick by painful brick. Log entry 3 alpha. Time indeterminate. Location maintenance corridor Gamma 9, sublevel 6. He paused, listening to his own breathing echo in the narrow space. Too fast, too shallow. He was a specimen, and he was failing his own observation. Subject. Subject is experiencing acute neurotoxic effects following direct, high-concentration exposure to an airborne agent. Presumed Class 3 mycotoxin with hallucinogenic properties. He unpacked a sterile syringe and an antiseptic wipe from his kit, the crinkle of the packaging deafeningly loud. He pulled up the sleeve of his vac suit, revealing the pale skin of his forearm. The wipe's cold chemical sting was a welcome, grounding sensation, real, tangible. Symptoms include severe tremors, disorientation, elevated heart rate, and vivid, personalized auditory and visual hallucinations. He gritted his teeth, the plastic of the syringe groaning in his grip. He had to get the needle in. His hand was jerking too much. It was pathetic. "Daddy, why is the water so loud?" The voice echoed in his memory, so clear, so perfect, it made his eyes burn. It wasn't just a sound. It was the specific timbre of her voice when she was 6, the slight lisp she had on her S sounds. The murmuration hadn't just projected an image, it had plundered the most sacred, locked-away corners of his brief and built a puppet from them. He squeezed his eyes shut. The agent appears to target and extrapolate from latent psychological trauma. It crafts a narrative designed to bypass rational thought. His voice was becoming strained, losing its forced robotic calm. The hallucination presented as a deceased family member. There, he'd said it. He had taken the most profound horror of his life and reduced it to a line item in a field report. It should have felt like a victory. It felt like a violation. With a surge of frustrated anger, he slammed his trembling hand against the tunnel wall to steady it, then plunged the needle into his vein. The sharp bite was a relief. Dark blood, almost black in the emergency lighting, swirled into the syringe. He drew a full 10 cc's, his breathing evening out slightly with the grimly satisfying focus of the task. He carefully extracted the needle, pressed a gauze pad to the puncture, and ejected the vial into a sterile vial. The click of the vial sealing was the most comforting sound in the world.
"Blood sample secured for full-spectrum analysis," he dictated, his voice now steadier, colder. He was Joric Kantor again, the debunker, the man who dissected gods and found only mold. Initial hypothesis: the fungal network uses a complex alkaloid to disrupt the prefrontal cortex while stimulating the amygdala and hippocampus. It doesn't create new information. It remixes memory, a biological weapon that turns a person's own history against them. Pathogen, not prophet. He stared at the vial of his own blood. It was just a fluid. The experience, the terror, the love that had been so real moments ago, it was all in there. A chain of proteins, a specific molecular structure. It could be analyzed, it could be understood, it could be neutralized. He held on to that thought like a man holding a single piece of driftwood in a rising tide. The tremor in his hands had subsided to a faint vibration. The armor was back in place, but he could feel the cracks running through it, feel the cold water seeping in. He looked down the length of the tunnel. It disappeared into a darkness so absolute it seemed to drink the orange light from his lamp. The dripping continued its maddeningly patient rhythm. The sweet, rotten smell seemed stronger now, a perfumed promise of an intimacy he found more terrifying than any monster. He clipped the recorder back to his wrist. "It wasn't her," he said. The words meant only for himself. It was the toxin's kiss, nothing more. But as he took his first shaky step forward into the suffocating dark, a single, devastating thought bloomed in his mind. A toxin can be cured, but what if it was telling the truth? The echo of her laughter still clung to the inside of his skull, a phantom resonance that Joric could feel behind his eyes. He pressed the heel of his hand against his forehead, the grimy polymer of his glove a poor anchor against the tide of memory. His breath hitched, a ragged counterpoint to the city's deep, metronomic hum. Beside him, more okayed, was a statue carved from scavenged metal and cynicism, her gaze fixed on the chasm ahead. She didn't speak, didn't need to. His trembling was loud enough for both of them. "I'm fine," he lied, his voice a dry rasp. He lowered his hand and forced himself to look.
They were on a maintenance gantry, a lattice of rust-eaten iron bolted to the weeping concrete wall of a vast cavernous space. Below them lay cistern Gamma 9 Beta. It wasn't a tank so much as a wound in the city's architecture, a colossal circular basin that might have been a public plaza in the old world. Now, it was a repository for the sector sins. The water, if it could be called that, was the color of week-old blood and engine oil, a viscous brown slurry that barely moved. A greasy, multicolored film shimmered on its surface under the sickly orange glow of failing emergency strips. The air was thick, heavy enough to chew, a nauseating cocktail of ozone from a nearby arcing conduit, the pervasive damp, and something else. Something cloyingly sweet, like honey left to rot in a grave. The smell of the murmuration. Joric's gaze swept from the water to the people. There had to be thousands of them. They packed the wide, terraced steps that descended to the basin's edge, a dense congregation of the city's forgotten, the damps. Their clothes were patched and threadbare, their faces pale and gaunt in the chemical twilight. They stood shoulder to shoulder, a collective body swaying with a single desperate rhythm. From them rose a sound that was both the source and the product of the oppressive atmosphere, a low, continuous murmur. It wasn't quite a chant, not yet. It was the sound of 1,000 whispered prayers, a susurrus of hope so raw and powerful it felt like a physical pressure against his ears. He raised his wrist, tapping the interface of his field scanner. The screen flickered to life, its clean clinical data a welcome shield. Atmospheric spore count, 112 ppm. Elevated, but not yet a critical hazard. Humidity, 98%. Structural integrity, G9B ETA, 47% and declining. An ABCA enforcer drone, a sleek black teardrop, drifted silently across the cavern ceiling, its single red optical sensor a malevolent star watching over the flock. "Look at them," Moreau said, her voice a low growl that cut through the murmuring, like algae worms waiting for the nutrient paste.
Joric didn't respond. He was trying to frame it, to compartmentalize. This was a textbook case study. A populace under extreme resource stress, a contaminated primary water source, a breakdown in official supply chains. Prime conditions for a crisis cult. The desperation below was a variable, a catalyst. It wasn't personal. It was a formula. Then he made the mistake of looking closer. He saw a man holding a small, limp child, stroking our hair as he stared at the foul water with an expression of terrifying faith. He saw an old woman, her face a road map of hard years, clutching a crudely carved fungal effigy, her lips moving silently. He saw a young couple, no older than 20, holding each other, their bodies trembling. Hope. Salt rot. It was hope, the most dangerous pathogen of them all. His carefully constructed composure began to crack. The murmur of the crowd seemed to change its pitch, deepening, resolving into a single, familiar word, a name. Leah. His daughter's name. No, it wasn't real. Just the spores, the stress, the lingering phantom of the hallucination from the tunnels. He squeezed his eyes shut. It didn't help. He could see her face, clear as the day he lost her, superimposed over the crowd. Her small hand in his, the feel of the rising water around his ankles, the scream that was stolen by the storm. He saw his wife, her face a mask of terror, his son staring up at him with uncomprehending eyes. "This is their fault," a voice whispered in his mind, a cold, alien thought that didn't feel like his own. They believed, they prayed to a silent sky, and the sea gave its answer. The murmur from the crowd swelled again, not his daughter's name this time, another one. Silas, Silas, Silas. Joric's eyes snapped open. The professional mask was gone, shattered. In its place was a raw, grim apprehension that felt like ice water in his veins. He looked at the crowd again, and he no longer saw a collection of desperate victims. He saw an army. He saw the terrifying power of a belief that promised to turn poison into purity. This wasn't just a gathering, it was a consecration, a declaration of war against the fundamental truth of their world, that some things could not be fixed, that some water was simply poison, that some losses were meaningless. Moreau must have seen the change in him. Her hand shot out and gripped his arm, her fingers like steel calipers. "Kantor," she said, "stay dry."
Her use of the common farewell, the mantra of their dying world, was a brutal splash of reality. He flinched, pulling his arm away. "I know what this is," he said. The words meant more for himself than for her. "It's a performance, mass hysteria fueled by biological agents." "Performance?"
Morrow scoffed, a bitter, humorless sound. She gestured with her chin towards the cistern. "They're out of BCA rations. The reclamation pump for this sector failed 3 days ago. That water," she paused, her voice dropping, "is the only thing they have left to drink. Performance or not, they'll be on their knees licking the scum off that basin by sunrise if Silas doesn't show." He knew she was right. That was the point. Silas hadn't chosen this place at random. This wasn't just a display of power, it was a masterclass in theological warfare. He was targeting the very source of the BCA's authority, purity. Control over the water was control over life itself. If he could deliver what the authority no longer could, he wouldn't just be a prophet, he would be a king. Joric leaned against the rusted railing, the cold, damp metal biting into his palms. The apprehension solidified into a cold, hard certainty. He wasn't here to observe a cult. He was here to witness the founding of a new God, born from rot and desperation. And as the crowd's chant for their Savior grew louder, echoing off the weeping walls of the dying city, Joric Kantor felt a sliver of an emotion he hadn't experienced in years. Fear. The hymn was gone. The raw, desperate sound of 1,000 souls finding release had faded, leaving behind only its ghost. It clung to the humid air like the spores themselves, an echo in the metronomic drip of water from the girders above. Joric stood on a rusted maintenance catwalk, his knuckles white where he gripped the safety rail. Below, the great cistern no longer swirled with the gray-brown filth of the gill racks. It pulsed with a soft, internal light, a milky, ethereal blue that seemed to breathe. It was the color of a dream, the color of a lie so beautiful you'd drown in it willingly. The sweet, cloying scent of honey and rot, the murmuration's signature perfume, was stronger than ever. It felt thick in his throat, a velvet coating on his tongue. He could still feel the phantom pressure of his daughter's hand in his, a hallucination so potent it had left a psychic stain. "It's just the spores, Joric. A chemical reaction, a misfiring of grieving synapses." The clinical detachment felt hollow, a prayer to a dead god called reason. Mora was a few feet away, a shadow detached from other shadows. She wasn't looking at the impossible water. She was scanning the dripping chasms around them, her head cocked, listening to the city's weeping, listening to the drip-cant. Her stillness was more unsettling than any panic. A burst of static erupted from Joric's wristcom, making him flinch. The harsh digital noise was a profanity in the sudden quiet. "Kantor, report." Kalen Rosk's voice sliced through the haze, tinny and stripped of all warmth by the device. "My drone feed cut out during the event. What is your assessment of the asset, Silas?" Joric swallowed, the action loud in his own ears. He stared at the glowing water. "Assessment," he repeated, the word feeling foreign. He had spent a career reducing gods to pathology reports, but this felt like trying to bottle a thunderstorm. Commander, he purified the cistern." There was a beat of silence on the other end, filled only by the crackle of an unstable connection. "Define purified. Did you acquire a sample for analysis? What are the parts per million of industrial contaminants, viral load?" "I don't have a field lab, Kalen," Joric snapped, his voice rougher than he had intended. He took a breath, trying to regain the clinical tone that had been his armor for 2 decades. "The visual is conclusive. The water is clear. It's glowing. The biomass of the mycelial network he manifested must be staggering. He plunged his arms in, and the entire volume of water was cleansed in under 3 minutes. He could practically hear Kalen's scowl. He catalyzed a bloom, Kantor, a fungal bloom. He didn't purify anything. He infected it. He turned a reservoir of non-potable water into a Class 4 biohazard, a delivery system. Joric's gaze drifted to the edge of the cistern, where damps were now kneeling, scooping the glowing water into their mouths with cupped hands, their faces elate with an ecstatic bliss that made his stomach clench. They weren't just drinking, they were communing. "They don't see it that way," Joric murmured. "I don't give a salt rot what they see." Kalen's voice sharpened, the synthetic edge fraying with tension. "The situation has degraded. Pump Station 9 Delta just went critical. We've lost containment pressure across the entire gamma grid. The floodwaters are rising faster than our projections." The deep, groaning hum of the city, the heartbeat that was the background noise of their entire existence, seemed to dip in pitch, a titan stumbling in the dark. Joric felt it in the soles of his boots. "Worse," Kalen continued. "Your prophet's light show has triggered mass hysteria. We have riots at the purity checkpoints in subsectors 4 and 5. They aren't trying to get away from the flood. They're trying to get here, to him, to the holy water." Joric closed his eyes. Of course. The BCA's power was absolute because they controlled the taps. Purity was their scripture, rationing their liturgy. And Silas had just turned water into wine. "The sector is a loss, Kantor." Kalen's voice was flat, the voice of a man amputating a limb to save the body. "I'm pulling all BCA assets. We're sealing the transit bulkheads to GAMMA 9. We'll contain the flood and the infection with it. Your extraction team is en route to your position. ETA, 8 minutes. You are to withdraw immediately." Withdraw. Retreat. Go back to the sterile white of the Eyrie, file his report, and let this whole district drown in its own miraculous poison. It was the logical choice, the only choice. He had a contract. He was a professional. This was just another job. But as he looked down at the impossible glow, he didn't see a biohazard. He saw a question aimed directly at the hollow space in his chest where his faith used to be. He saw the face of his daughter Elspeth, smiling at him from the depths of a spore-induced dream. "Daddy, look, it's pretty." To leave now was to accept Kalen's explanation. A catalyst, an infection, a pathogen. It was to validate his own life's work, to reaffirm his belief that the universe was a cold, meaningless machine. But for the first time in decades, a terrifying splinter of doubt had lodged itself in his soul. What if this wasn't just a disease? What if it was an answer? The thought was more horrifying than any monster he could imagine, because if there was an answer, it meant there was a purpose. And if there was a purpose, then his family's death, it wasn't just a random, cruel act of nature. His fear of discovering a real God was warring with his absolute, obsessive need to prove this one was a fraud. He couldn't do that from the Eyrie. He had to get to the source. He had to find the man, the organism, the thing at the center of it all, and tear its divinity apart with his bare hands. "Kantor, acknowledge the order," Kalen's voice demanded, pulling him from the spiral. Joric looked at Morrow. She met his gaze, her own eyes dark and unreadable. She hadn't moved, hadn't reacted to the calm call. She was waiting for his decision. He was the contract. Her survival was tied to his. He slowly raised his wrist, his finger hovering over the calm's glowing rune. He thought of the reports he would write, the sterile language he would use to describe this moment. Anomalous bioluminescent phenomenon. Mass psychological event. It was all ash. Meaningless. "Negative, Commander," Joric said. His own voice sounded alien to him, calm and steady. The grim apprehension had burned away, leaving behind a cold, hard certainty. The static on the line intensified for a second. "Repeat that, Kantor. I believe I misheard you." "I said negative," Joric repeated, his gaze locked on the glowing water. "My mission is to find the source of this faith and analyze it. The source is not at the extraction point. I'm not finished. Your mission is what I say it is." Kalen's control finally shattered, the vocoder distorting his fury into a digital snarl. "You are a civilian contractor, Kantor, not a field agent. You will follow my direct order, or I will have you dragged back here in cuffs and sumped for insubordination. Do you understand me? This is not a request."
Joric looked away from the cistern, away from the ghost of his daughter and the terrible beauty of the lie. He looked into the oppressive darkness of the gill racks, the labyrinth of weeping metal and desperate lives that stretched down into the drowned heart of the world. Morrow gave a single sharp nod, a silent acknowledgment of a new contract being written in the space between them. She was already turning, melting back into the shadows of a maintenance tunnel. With a deliberate press of his thumb, Joric severed the connection. Kalen's rage was cut off mid-shout, replaced by the profound, humming silence of the deep city. He had just declared war on the only power left in Benthos. He was no longer a theologian. He was a heretic, and his descent had just begun. The phantom scent of rain on dry earth still clung to the inside of Joric's skull, a chemical impossibility, a memory so potent it felt like a prophecy. Anya's laugh, light as ash, echoed in the space where his own faith used to be. He pressed the heels of his hands into his eyes, trying to force the hallucination back into its box. But the image of her small hand waving from the crest of a green hill was seared onto his vision. He was crouched in a maintenance alcove overlooking the Gamma-9 cistern, a dripping metal cage smelling of ozone and rust. Beside him, Morrow Cade was a statue carved from shadow, her breath a steady, silent rhythm against the city's cacophony. Below them, a sea of ragged humanity pressed against the cistern's containment railing. The damps. Their faces, upturned and pale in the greasy blue glow of the murmuration's early bloom, were masks of desperate hope. It was a look Joric knew well. He'd made a career of peeling that look off people's faces and showing them the rot underneath. But this time felt different. The pathogen had used his daughter's face as a key. His wristcom chimed, a sterile, intrusive sound in the humid air. Commander Kalen Rask's face materialized in a blocky, orange-tinged hologram above his gauntlet. "Kantor, report. Crowd density estimates are fluctuating. What's your on-site analysis?"
Joric took a breath, forcing the professional veneer back into place. He scanned the crowd, the theologian's detached gaze cataloging the symptoms. "Density is approaching critical, maybe 1,000 souls. They're exhibiting stage 1 symptoms, auditory phenomena, mild glossolalia, standard whispering sickness." He looked past the crowd to the cistern itself, a vast concrete bowl, its surface shimmering with a rainbow slick of industrial runoff and bio-waste. The water was poison, a slow death for anyone foolish enough to drink it. And yet the crowd stared at it like it was a promised land. "The prophet? Silas? He's not here yet?" Joric added, his voice flat. "They're waiting for him, building the atmosphere." "Atmosphere is an irrelevant metric," Kalen's voice crackled. "This is a public health crisis, Kantor, a contamination vector. I want your biological assessment of the promissory agent. What is he offering that makes them risk this level of spore exposure?"
"He's offering Anya's smile," a voice whispered in Joric's mind. "He's offering the world before the water." Joric flinched. He dragged his eyes back to the hologram. "He's offering water, Commander. Clean water. A miracle." Kalen's digitized face was a mask of contempt. A flicker of static distorted his features. "Purity is a function of engineering, not prayer. A parlor trick. Some scavenged filtration unit. A chemical agent. It's a fraud. Your job was to identify the mechanism of that fraud." "I need to see it happen," Joric said, the words tasting like gravel. The compulsion was a physical thing now, a hook in his gut. The hallucination hadn't been a random firing of infected synapses. It was a message, a threat, a violation of the one sacred memory he had left. "Negative, theologian. Your preliminary assessment is sufficient. The risk of concentrated exposure is too high, and the potential for civil unrest is escalating. I'm recalling you. Purity strike teams are en route to handle dispersal."
Dispersal. The BCA's clean, sterile word for shock malls and high-pressure hoses loaded with sedatives, for cracking skulls to maintain structured survivalism. Joric looked at the faces in the crowd below, gaunt, tired, their hopes so fragile it was almost painful to witness. Kalen would wash them away like so much filth, and the source of the infection, the intelligence behind this blasphemy, would simply recede back into the city's weeping walls. He felt the ghost of a small hand slip into his. "Don't let them, Papa. Salt rot."
"Kantor, confirm you've received my directive," Kalen's voice demanded, sharper now. "Your mission is terminated. Fall back to the designated extraction point, now."
Joric's gaze was fixed on the putrid water of the cistern. He saw not the oily sheen, but the reflection of a world he'd lost, a world this fungal god promised to return. It was an elegant, beautiful, and utterly predatory lie. It was the most dangerous thing he had ever encountered, not because it could kill, but because it knew precisely what to offer a man who had nothing left. Duty, protocol, the BCA, the sterile logical world of the airy. It all felt a million miles away, a meaningless abstraction. His contract was with them, but his war was now with the thing that wore his daughter's memory. This was no longer a job. It was an exorcism.
"Joric, do you copy? Your comm is registering an elevated heart rate. Are you compromised?"
Joric slowly lifted his hand. Mora watched him, her eyes catching the pale fungal light, saying nothing. She had seen men make these choices before. The moment a man decides which abyss he's willing to leap into. He looked at Kalen's pixelated, impatient face, the face of order, the face of a system that had saved his body but let his soul drown 82 years ago. He thought of Anya, not as a memory, but as an effigy desecrated by this creeping, singing rot. My hunt, he thought, a cold, clean certainty cutting through the fog of grief and infection. Not the BCA's. Mine. This is your final... With a decisive movement, Joric thumbed the comm panel on his gauntlet. He didn't just mute the transmission, he severed the link. The hologram of Kalen Rask vanished with a fizzle of orange light and a final sharp snap of static. Silence descended, thick and heavy. The only sounds were the rhythmic drip of condensation from a pipe overhead, the distant groan of the city's superstructure, and the faint, collective murmur of the crowd below, a sound halfway between a prayer and a moan. Joric lowered his hand. The air felt different, thinner. He was untethered, a ghost floating free in the drowned cradle. Morrow finally spoke, her voice a low rasp. That was a choice, theologian. Joric didn't look at her. His eyes, burning with a new and terrible fire, remained fixed on the expectant crowd and the poison water. His defiance had cooled instantly into something harder, colder, obsessive focus. "Take me down there," he said, his voice quiet, devoid of all its earlier friction. It was the voice of a man who had just found his one true and final purpose. "I'm not leaving until I see this prophet with my own eyes." The basin stank of despair. It was a specific bouquet, one Joric had learned to catalog over a decade of debunking gods in the weeping guts of Benthos. It started with the bass notes, the metallic tang of rust-leached water, the sour breath of unwashed bodies packed too close, and the acrid ammonia of urine in the corners. Layered over that was the cloying sweetness of the murmuration itself, a scent like honey spilled over a corpse. But the top note, the one that defined this place, was the thin, sharp scent of desperation, a pheromonal cry for a miracle. From our perch on a skeletal maintenance gantry 20 meters above, Cistern Gamma 9 Beta was a colossal concrete wound in the city's flesh. Emergency lights cast long orange sickles across the gathered mass of damps, their faces upturned, pallid in the gloom. They huddled around the edge of a vast, unmoving pool of water so foul it barely reflected the light. A greasy rainbow film of industrial runoff swirled on its surface, and bloated fronds of ochre algae drifted just beneath. This was not water. It was a vector, a chemical soup that promised a week of violent dysentery followed by a quiet death. And these people were here to see it blessed. No sign of him. Morrow's voice was a low rasp beside me, barely audible over the collective cough and murmur of the crowd and the eternal groan of the city's stressed superstructure. She kept her magnoculars trained on the far tunnel entrance, a study in coiled stillness. "You sure your source was good?"
"The source is never good," I muttered, not looking away from my own feed. My wrist interface projected a filtered schematic of the basin over my vision. I was tracing pressure lines, electrical conduits, potential hidden diffusers. A miracle required infrastructure. Faith was just the anesthetic used during the procedure. "It's just less bad than the others. He'll be here. This is a theatrical production, and the audience is assembled." My own obsession was a cold, clean thing, a problem of physics and biology. How did the whispering sickness spread so efficiently here? Why were the spore counts fluctuating so wildly? Silas, the so-called first hymner, was the variable I couldn't account for, the nexus of the infection. Find him, find his methodology, and the god collapses into a pathogen. Simple, repeatable, the core of my own bitter faith. I felt a ghost flicker of a memory, a small hand in mine, a tiny voice asking why the rain smelled bad. I crushed it.
pushed it down into the dark place where I kept my family. Clinical detachment was a muscle. Mine was the strongest I'd ever known. Then, a change. It wasn't a sound, not at first. It was a shift in pressure, a ripple through the collective. The aimless shuffling of hundreds of bodies resolved into a unified motion. A pathway opened through the crowd. It wasn't forced. No one was pushed aside. They simply parted. Like iron filings aligning to an unseen magnet, they flowed back, creating a wide, empty corridor that led directly to the cistern's contaminated lip. They held their breath. The cacophony of coughing and whispers died, replaced by a sound I found far more disturbing. Silence. Salt-rocked, Morrow breathed. "Here we go." He walked into the orange light, and all my theories felt instantly inadequate. I was expecting a showman, a wild-eyed zealot draped in mycelial growths, or a hulking brute cowing the masses with strength. I was expecting a trickster with pockets full of psychotropics and hidden tech. The man who called himself Silas was none of those things. He was unassuming, of average height, with a lean frame lost in a simple patched boiler suit, the ubiquitous uniform of the damps. It was cleaner than most, the gray fabric meticulously scrubbed. His face was narrow, his dark hair cut short. He could have been any one of the thousands of laborers who kept Benthos from collapsing.
But it was his eyes and his stillness that set him apart. He moved with a preternatural calm, his gait smooth and unhurried. There was no fear in him, no disgust. In a city where every citizen wore a mask of weary vigilance, his expression was one of serene, untroubled peace. He looked at the sea of desperate faces, not with the predatory glee of a con man, but with a look of profound, almost sorrowful compassion. My finger traced lines on my datapad. No visible mutations, no spore sacs. Gait is steady, no sign of neurological degradation. Pupils are not dilated. He's not high on dust. It was a litany of denials against the evidence of my own eyes. This man's very presence was a contradiction to the laws of this world. Nobody was this calm. Nobody was this clean. He reached the edge of the cistern. The damps nearest to him flinched back from the foul lip of the basin, their hands covering their mouths against the stench. Silas did not. He stopped with the toes of his worn boots inches from the shimmering, toxic water. He looked down into it, and for a moment I thought I saw a flicker of a smile touch his lips, not of mockery, but of recognition, as if he were greeting an old friend. My mind raced, cycling through possibilities. A filtration unit hidden beneath the basin, activated by a pressure plate where he's standing? An aerosolized chemical agent released from the ventilation ducts, timed to his arrival, that neutralizes the contaminants? A mass hallucination triggered by a low-frequency broadcast? I scanned the vents, checked for anomalous energy readings. Nothing. Beneath us, the silence had become absolute. The constant metronomic drip of condensation from the ceiling beams seemed as loud as hammer blows. The low-frequency hum of the city's distant pumps, the heartbeat, was a physical vibration in my bones. It was the holiest kind of quiet, the kind that precedes a revelation or an execution. Every eye in the basin, hundreds of them, raw with hope and sickness, was fixed on the still figure at the water's edge. My own breath felt loud in my ears. The cold, obsessive focus that had driven me for days was beginning to thaw at the edges.
replaced by a frustrating, deeply unsettling curiosity. I couldn't see the wires. I couldn't see the mirrors. This wasn't some back-alley sporehead promising visions for a few Kal-El. This was something else, a performance of a different magnitude. The sheer control he wielded, without a single word, was a force of nature. Then, slowly, Silas raised his right hand. The gesture was simple, open-palmed, a sign of peace, a call to order. But in that pressurized silence, under the weight of 1,000 desperate prayers, it felt like the beginning of the world. My throat was suddenly dry. Stay dry. The old greeting felt like a prayer of my own. My professional detachment, my shield against the horrors and hopes of this drowned world, had a crack in it. And through that crack, for the first time in a very long time, a terrifying question seeped in. Not, how is he doing this, but a far more dangerous one. What if he is? The air in the cavernous cistern chamber was thick enough to drink, heavy with the metallic tang of rust and the cloying fungal sweetness that Joric now associated with his own impending madness. He lay prone on a corroded catwalk 400 feet above the basin floor, the grated metal digging into his ribs. Beside him, Moro was a silent, compact shadow, her rifle resting easily in her lap. Below, a sea of upturned faces, hundreds of damps packed shoulder to weeping shoulder, their collective hope a palpable pressure in the humid gloom. Joric adjusted the focus on his optical suite, the magnification humming softly against his cheekbone. The target? Cistern Gamma 7, a concrete bowl a quarter-mile wide, filled with the city's cast-off filth. A shimmering membrane of chemical runoff and raw effluents coated its surface, catching the stark orange of the emergency lamps in greasy rainbows. The smell that rose from it was a physical assault, rot and ammonia and something acridly industrial. Purity, the only true currency, was the absence of this.
His mind, a well-oiled engine of disbelief, was already running diagnostics. Mass hallucination via aerosolized psychotropes vented from the ducts? Unlikely. The dispersal would be too uneven. A pre-placed chemical agent set to trigger on a timer? Possible, but the sheer volume of reactant needed to neutralize this much sludge would be monumental, impossible to hide. High-frequency sonics to cause flocculation? No, the power signature would light up every sensor in the sector. Every miracle was just a trick of physics you hadn't unraveled yet. Then he saw him. Silas moved through the crowd not like a leader, but like water finding its own level. He parted the sea of bodies without touching a soul, a bubble of serene silence expanding around him. He was Fenn, his simple gray tunic hanging loose on his frame, but he didn't look frail. There was a strange luminescence to his skin, a pearlescent sheen under the grime, as if his flesh were woven with the same mycelium that draped the bloom deeps. Joric zoomed in. The prophet's eyes were calm, impossibly calm, reflecting the desperation of his flock without absorbing any of it. He reached the cistern's edge, a crumbling concrete lip overlooking the vast pool of poison. The crowd held its breath, a single, unified lung. "Showtime," Moro murmured, her voice a low rasp beside him. "You got your little box of tricks ready to call shenanigans, Doc?" Joric didn't answer. He was tracking Silas's hands. No rings, no wrist-mounted tech, no hidden injectors in his fingertips, just hands. He watched the man kneel, the rough concrete staining his trousers. There was no sermon,
No grand pronouncements. The silence was the sermon, a terrifyingly confident void where spectacle was supposed to be.
It wasn't a chemical flare or an electrical discharge. It was organic, alive. A single point of soft, verdant light bloomed where Silas's hand met the filth. It pulsed once, a soft, silent beat that Joric felt in his teeth. Then, from that single point of contact, a network of impossible beauty erupted. Tendrils of living light, finer than spun glass, shot out from his fingertips. They weren't just spreading across the surface, they were weaving a tapestry, an intricate geometric lattice of glowing mycelium that expanded with terrifying, intelligent speed. Joric's mind screamed for an explanation. Symbiotic bioluminescent bacteria? A novel form of chemiluminescence triggered by the water's specific pH? The theories were hollow, pathetic denials against the evidence of his own eyes. The network of light didn't slow. It raced across the entire quarter-mile surface in seconds, a web of emerald and sapphire fire thrown over a lake of black oil. Then it dove. Through his magnifier, Joric could see the glowing filaments plunging into the depths, branching, multiplying, illuminating the entire volume of the cistern. The vast concrete bowl became a captured galaxy, a three-dimensional blueprint of a new kind of life. The sound from the crowd was a single sharp intake of breath, a gasp of 1,000 souls witnessing the birth of their God. The miracle wasn't the light. The miracle was what the light was doing. The mycelial web began to pulse, a slow, rhythmic thrum, and where it pulsed, the filth vanished. Joric watched, his knuckles white where he gripped the catwalk, as the tendrils consumed everything. He saw floating particulates of rust and refuse break down, dissolving into nothing. He saw the oily chemical sheen vaporize. The thick brown sludge around each glowing thread clarified, the murky water thinning into perfect, impossible transparency. The overpowering stench of decay was gone, scoured from the air. In its place rose the scent of clean ozone, of wet stone and rich, dark earth after a cleansing rain. It was the smell of a world long dead. The smell of purity.
In less than 2 minutes, it was over. The entire cistern, millions of calibrated liters of toxic waste, was now a basin of crystal clear water, glowing with a gentle, residual light from within. The mycelial network, its work done, faded back into Silas, the light receding into his skin, until only the faint venous patterns on his hands remained. He stood up, water dripping from his fingers. Water so clean Joric could see the distorted reflection of the orange lamps on the ceiling, hundreds of feet above. Below, the silence broke. It was not a cheer. It was a raw, primal cry of deliverance. People wept, their shoulders shaking with a grief and joy too profound for words. They stumbled forward, falling to their knees at the cistern's edge, scooping the glowing water into their hands, splashing it on their faces, drinking it with the thirst of the damned finding paradise. A mass conversion not by word but by deed. A miracle that couldn't be faked, couldn't be explained away, couldn't be debunked. Joric slowly lowered the optical suite. His hands were shaking. His heart hammered a frantic, terrified rhythm against his ribs. Every protocol, every scientific principle, every cynical axiom that had formed the bedrock of his existence had just been liquefied and poured into the abyss. He was a man who traded in the quantifiable, who believed the universe was a machine of cold, meaningless logic.
But there was no logic for this, no equation. It defied the laws of thermodynamics. It was a violation of reality itself. He felt the familiar ghost image of his daughter, her small hand reaching for his, but for the first time it wasn't a comfort. It was an accusation. "You see, Daddy?" A voice that was not a voice whispered in his mind. "You see what you stopped believing in?" So... Morrow's voice cut through his paralysis, quiet and strained. She sounded as shaken as he felt. "Got a theory for that one, Doc?" Joric opened his mouth, but no sound came out. He just stared at the impossible, unblemished water, and for the first time since the final deluge had taken his family, he felt the terrifying, vertigo-inducing sensation of standing on the edge of a faith that might actually be real.
The light died, but the image was seared onto the back of Joric's retinas, a ghost tree of impossible luminescence blooming in a pool of filth. The air, once thick with the metallic tang of contaminated water and wet rust, now carried a shockingly clean scent, sharp and sterile like the ozone after a lightning strike, undercut with the murmuration's signature fragrance of honey and decay. Below, in the cavernous cistern plaza, the crowd of damps stood frozen, a forest of ragged statues staring into the now crystal-clear water. The city's heartbeat, the low-frequency thrum of the distant pumps, seemed to be the only thing moving in the universe. "Salt rot," Morrow breathed beside him, her voice a raw scrape of disbelief. It's clean." "No," Joric muttered, his fingers tightening on the corroded railing of their overlook. His mind, his one true sanctuary, was a frantic scramble of rationalizations. "It's a biological reaction, a hyper-efficient coagulant. The mycelium is acting as a natural filter, binding with the heavy metal particulates and sinking them. It's just chemistry." He said the words, but they felt hollow, a desperate prayer to a god of logic that had just been spat on. The silence below shattered. A woman at the front of the crowd, her face a roadmap of hardship and malnutrition, let out a choked sob. It wasn't a sound of pain, but of a pain suddenly, miraculously lifted. She stumbled forward, falling to her knees at the cistern's edge. Her hands, scarred and trembling, cupped the water. For a heartbeat, the entire district held its breath. She brought the water to her lips and drank. Her eyes widened. She drank again, deeper this time, water spilling down her chin and staining the front of her grimy jumpsuit. A beatific smile, terrifying in its purity, spread across her face. "The hymn! It is true!" she wept, her voice echoing in the sudden quiet. "The water, it sings! It is unblemished!" That was the signal. The dam of decades of fear and thirst broke. With a single, unified roar that was more animal than human, the crowd surged forward. It was a wave of pure, unthinking desperation, a chaotic crush of bodies shoving and clawing their way to the water's edge. They fell upon the cistern like starving beasts, scooping the water with their hands, with scavenged cups, with their mouths directly from the surface. Cries of joy and relief echoed off the weeping concrete walls, a cacophony of salvation that made Joric's skin crawl. "They're fools," he said, his voice tight. "They don't know what's in it. Spores, gilled to the teeth with them." "They're thirsty, Kantor," Morrow countered, her gaze fixed on the scene, a grim fascination in her eyes. "Thirstier than they are scared. Can you blame them?"
He couldn't, and that was the worst part. He watched a father lift his small child, pouring the clear liquid into the girl's waiting mouth. The girl who couldn't have been more than 5, the same age as... No, he wouldn't think about that. He watched her drink, saw the relief on her father's face, a look of such profound love and gratitude that it felt like a physical blow. This was the mechanism of faith laid bare, a promise whispered into the ear of absolute despair. And here, today, the promise had been kept. It was then that he saw the change.
Morrow followed his gaze, her own expression hardening. The chaos was beginning to subside, but not in a natural way. There was no post-frenzy exhaustion, no bickering over the last drops. Instead, a wave of tranquility was spreading through the crowd as inexorably as the fungus had spread through the water. Person by person, the frantic individualism was being erased. The pushing stopped. The crying ceased. The frantic scooping of water gave way to a slow, deliberate stillness. One by one they turned. Their movements were no longer jerky or desperate. They were fluid, strangely synchronized, like a school of fish turning in unison. They turned away from the water that had saved them and faced the man who had brought it. Silas. He stood on the far side of the cistern, his arms still dripping, a Messiah watching his flock being born. "That's not happiness," Joric breathed, the professional theologian in him analyzing the horror with a cold, sickening clarity. "That is an absence. It's vacancy. The self, the ego, it's been scoured clean." He felt a profound, primal terror grip him. This wasn't just a biological agent that caused hallucinations or sickness. This was a psychological one. It didn't kill the body, it murdered the soul and left a placid, smiling corpse in its place. He thought of his daughter's laugh, his wife's stubborn frown, the infinite, chaotic, beautiful mess of a human personality. The murmuration didn't just consume you, it unmade you. It offered a heaven that was nothing more than a painless, thoughtless void. The entire crowd now stood in near-perfect silence, a congregation of hundreds facing their prophet. Their faces, all smoothed into the same beatific mask, were tilted upward. A low sound began to rise from them, a soft, consonant-free hum that was perfectly in tune. It wasn't a hymn of praise from individual throats. It was a single, resonant frequency produced by a new composite organism. The sound vibrated in Joric's bones, a deeply alien and terrifying chord.
His own nihilism had been a shield, a bleak comfort. There are no gods, only pathogens. There is no meaning, only random, cruel nature. But what he was witnessing defied that creed. This was a pathogen that behaved like a god. It performed miracles. It offered salvation. It answered prayers. It was a biological process that perfectly mimicked the mechanisms of faith, and in doing so, created a hell far more absolute than any fire and brimstone sermon could conjure. The BCA drone overhead emitted a sharp metallic chirp as it pivoted, its optical sensor taking in the silent, humming army. Joric knew Kalen was watching this. He was seeing his authority, built on the rationing of purity, evaporate in a single, undeniable miracle. Kalen would see a threat to be sterilized, but Joric saw something worse. He saw a truth, a terrible, seductive truth that could swallow the world. He took a step back from the railing, a cold sweat breaking on his brow. The mission was no longer about debunking. It was no longer about a paycheck or proving a philosophical point. The hallucination of his daughter's face swam in his vision, her eyes wide with a fear that was now his own. This thing had to be destroyed, not contained, not studied. Destroyed. Joric didn't run. He retreated, a clockwork marionette with its strings cut, stumbling backward into the greasy mouth of the maintenance corridor. The roar of the crowd was a physical blow, a wave of sound that slammed into him and echoed in the marrow of his bones. 1,000 voices, maybe more, raised in a single ecstatic chorus that was no longer human. It was the sound of a dam breaking, of a city's collective despair finding a drain. His back hit the cold, weeping concrete of the corridor wall. He slid down its slimy surface, his legs giving out. The metal grill of the overlook was a stark rectangle of sickly green light against the oppressive dark, framing the scene he was trying to flee. But you couldn't flee a memory seared onto your retinas. Silas, arms outstretched, a messiah sculpted from rot and revelation. The water, a cesspool of rust and effluent one moment, transformed into a basin of impossible liquid light the next. The mycelial latticework spreading through it, a nervous system of pure, unblemished white, devouring filth and exhaling purity.
Joric's heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic drum against the city's steady, groaning heartbeat. His mind, his only true sanctuary, was a fortress under siege. He scrambled for the weapons he'd always trusted: logic, skepticism, reason. A chemical reaction, the forensic theologian in him insisted, the voice of his training now thin and reedy. Preceded with a catalytic agent, the mycelium acts as a hyper-efficient filter, but it's just biology, accelerated biology. But the scale of it, the speed. He had run the numbers on purifying that much water. With BCA-grade reclamation tech, the kind of machinery that filled entire sectors, it would take a week at peak efficiency. Aqua Veritas might do it in 3 days, for a price that would bankrupt a generation. Silas had done it in 2 minutes, with his bare hands. No. The word was a dry rasp in his throat, swallowed by the drip, drip, drip of condensation from a leaking pipe overhead. Each drop struck a puddle near his boot with a fat, mocking splash. Mass hysteria, then. A trick of the light. The spores are a powerful hallucinogen. They only thought they saw it. A crowd desperate for a sign, manufacturing its own salvation. He squeezed his eyes shut, but the image was burned on the inside of his eyelids. He'd seen it. He had his own spore filter running, his blood saturation levels monitored by his wrist interface. He was the control group, and he had seen it. He fumbled at his side, pulling a small cylindrical scanner from his belt. He pointed its emitter at the overlook, his hand shaking so violently the targeting laser danced across the far wall. The air analysis readout scrolled across the device's tiny screen. Spore count was astronomical, yes, but there were other spikes. Ozone, a strange cocktail of complex proteins he didn't recognize, and a massive drop in airborne toxins. The air itself, spilling out from the cistern, was cleaner, quantifiably, irrefutably cleaner. He dropped the scanner. It clattered on the grated floor, its light flickering out. Salt rot. It wasn't a trick. It wasn't hysteria. It was real.
Every case he had ever worked, every self-proclaimed prophet and back-alley messiah had been a fraud, a con artist using cheap chemistry, a charismatic leader exploiting a localized neurotoxin, a simple, ugly, human lie. He dismantled them. He exposed their mechanisms. He took their followers' hope and showed them the empty, meaningless clockwork behind the curtain, because that was the truth, the only truth. Suffering was random. Death was an ending. There were no gods, only pathogens. Until now. He felt a presence beside him and flinched, scrambling away, his hand instinctively going for the sidearm he no longer carried. But there was nothing there. Just a shimmer in the humid air. Then, the scent of rain on dry earth, a smell that didn't exist in Benthos. The smell of his daughter's hair after playing outside, before the world drowned. "It's pretty, Daddy." Lily stood a few feet away, a perfect translucent phantom against the corroded wall. She wasn't the screaming, waterlogged horror from his nightmares. She was just her, 7 years old, in her favorite yellow jumper, her face tilted with childish curiosity. She wasn't looking at him. She was looking back towards the light from the cistern. Joric's breath hitched. He couldn't speak. He couldn't move. This was the infection, the spores rewriting his synapses, pulling from his deepest grief to build a puppet he couldn't resist. "It's not real," he whispered, the words meant for himself. "You're not real. You're a symptom." The apparition of his daughter turned to him. Her eyes held no accusation, no ghostly sorrow, only a placid, unnerving calm. "Does that make it not pretty?" she asked. The simple, flawless logic of a child. It sliced through his frantic denials more effectively than any argument. The beauty he'd witnessed, the hope it ignited. Did its origin matter if the effect was absolute? He had seen a god perform a miracle of compassion, and his first instinct was to classify it as an anomalous biological event, a failure of logic. His logic hadn't failed. It had been rendered irrelevant. He was a man who performed autopsies on faiths, and he had just witnessed a resurrection. He had spent his entire life, since the deluge, building a worldview on the foundational certainty that the universe was indifferent, that it did not answer prayers, that it did not perform miracles, that it did not have a will. He had been wrong. He pushed himself to his feet, his body aching, his mind a raw, open wound. The roar from the cistern was softening now, replaced by a sound that was somehow more chilling, a low, harmonious hum. A hymn. The sound of 10,000 souls finding a single voice. This wasn't a disease. A disease doesn't purify water on a municipal scale as an act of public theater. This wasn't a toxin. A toxin doesn't manifest as the ghost of your dead child to debate metaphysics with you in a sewer. This was something else. He looked at his hands, seeing not his own skin, but the memory of Silas's sprouting with glowing white filaments. An act of will, a conscious choice. He had been sent here to debunk a cult, to trace the source of a contagion. He had fundamentally, catastrophically miscalculated. He wasn't a doctor studying a plague. He was an exterminator who had just stumbled into the cathedral of an alien god. An intelligence, a thinking, learning, powerful entity that had just announced its arrival. The dawning clarity was not a comfort. It was a freezing wave of terror that washed over him colder and deeper than any ocean. His mission was not to understand. It was not to cure. It was to survive a war he hadn't even known he was fighting. The broadcast clawed at their backs as they ran. Kalen's voice, filtered through the district's wheezing voxcasters, was stripped of all humanity. A flat, metallic sentence of death. Joric Kantor, by the authority of the BCA, you are designated sump-tainted. Surrender for cleansing. The words echoed in the corroded maintenance tunnel, mingling with the frantic slap of their boots on the grated floor and Joric's own ragged gasps for air that tasted of rust and ozone. Murrow was a shadow ahead of him, her movements economical and certain. She didn't look back. She didn't need to. Fear was its own leash, and she knew he was on it. She hooked a sharp right, her hand finding a recessed lever in the dripping dark. A section of wall groaned open, revealing a cavity no larger than a coffin. "In," she hissed, her voice barely a whisper above the ever-present hum of the city's heartbeat. He stumbled inside, and the heavy panel slid shut with a pneumatic sigh that felt horribly final. Darkness, absolute and suffocating, pressed in. The only sound was his own heart hammering against his ribs, a frantic counter-rhythm to the city's slow, deep thrum. Kalen's voice was gone, muffled by layers of concrete and steel. But it was still there, inside his head, sump-tainted. A harsh, focused beam from Morrow's headlamp cut through the black, illuminating the space. It was a disused comms alcove, a nest of dead technology. Thick bundles of copper wiring, their insulation cracked and peeling, spilled from the walls like metallic entrails. A comms panel, its screen a spider web of fractures, was bolted to the far wall, a single orange diagnostic light blinking with obstinate futility. The air was thick with the smell of burnt electronics and the cloying, sweet decay of fungal blossoms that had found their way in through some unseen crack. "He won't find us here." Morrow's voice was flat, a statement of fact, not reassurance. She was already working, pulling a small toolkit from her pack. "BCA sweeps don't check dead nodes. Too much interference. Wastes power." Joric leaned against the cold, weeping wall, his body trembling. He wasn't just running from Kalen. He was running from the image seared behind his eyes. Silas, standing in that foul cistern, arms plunged into the muck, the eruption of impossible, gentle light. The vast, intricate web of mycelium spreading like a ghost through the water, turning poison into purity. He'd seen the faces of the damps, the raw, unadulterated hope, an emotion he'd catalogued as the most dangerous of all pathogens, and he had felt something akin to it himself, a terrifying awe. Salt rot. "What now, airy man?" Morrow asked, not looking up from her work as she pried open a corroded access panel. The question was a scalpel, cutting through his panic. He looked at his hands. They were shaking. These were the hands of a forensic theologian, hands that dissected belief, that pinned faith to a specimen board and exposed it as a virus, a spore, a chemical imbalance. But what he had seen, it wasn't just a pathogen. It had intention, it had power. It had performed a miracle on a scale that defied every parameter he had ever studied. I don't know," he finally managed, the words tasting like ash.
Morrow stopped her work and finally turned to him. The beam of her lamp caught the cynical glint in her eyes. "Yes, you do," she said, her voice low. "You've got two paths. Path 1. You crawl back up, find a BCA patrol and beg. They'll strap you to a cleansing chair and burn the sickness out of you. Along with your mind, you'll be a good, quiet citizen of the area again, a drooling one."
Joric flinched. He thought of the purity sweeps, the blank-eyed individuals left in their wake. Path 2, she continued, gesturing down into the floor, into the oppressive dark of Benthos, is you accept what you are now, a ghost, tainted just like he said. You cut the cord and you go deeper. You find your answers in the rot where they belong. Safety. The word was a siren song. His apartment in the airy, the sterile white polymer, the recycled air that didn't smell of decay, the silence. He could go back. He could tell Kalen what he saw, plead his case, say the spore exposure had compromised his judgment. A lie. A comfortable, soul-destroying lie. But then he saw his daughter's face, the hallucination from before, her small hand in his. "Are you going to leave us again, Daddy?" Was that the spore talking, or was it his own guilt given a voice by the fungus? It didn't matter. The question was the same. To go back up was to abandon them again, to abandon the truth of what happened to them, to accept that their deaths and the miracle at the cistern were just meaningless data points in a chaotic universe. His entire life's work, his whole bitter philosophy was built on that meaninglessness. But what if he was wrong? The fear of that was a cold abyss opening beneath him, far deeper than any chasm in Benthos. His resolve hardened, calcifying his terror into something sharp and purposeful. He looked down at his left wrist. The BCA interface, a sleek band of dark metal, was still active. Its green light, once a symbol of his status and access, now felt like a slave's collar. It was blinking softly, a tracker, his lifeline, his chain. "You're right," he said, his voice now steady, imbued with a terrifying clarity. Morrow just watched, her expression unreadable. He raised his arm. For a second, he hesitated. Everything he was, everything he had owned and believed in, was encoded in that device. It was Joric Kantor. Then he brought his wrist down, hard against the jutting, rusted conduit. The sound was a sickening crack of plastic and crystal. Pain flared up his arm, hot and electric. He did it again and again. A strangled cry tore from his throat, a sound of pure anguish and liberation. The green light flickered, stuttered, and died. The screen was a black, shuttered mess. He was bleeding from a cut on his knuckles, the dark red a shocking smear against his pale skin. He stood breathing heavily, staring at the dead device. Joric Kantor, the forensic theologian of the BCA, was gone. In his place was just a man, a ghost. Morrow gave a single, slow nod, an almost imperceptible sign of approval. She reached into her pack and tossed him a small, grimy object. It was a data chip, its contacts crudely soldered. "That's your new life," she said. "Splice it into the panel. It'll get you onto the whisper net, the drip-cant. No names, no trackers, just signals and shadows. Cost you 50 cows to open the channel." Joric didn't even think about the price. He moved to the comms panel, his hands working with a feverish precision he didn't know he still possessed. He ripped out the dead BCA hardware, the wires sparking faintly. His fingers, slick with his own blood, deftly inserted the black market chip and began splicing the thin, corroded wires. The skills he'd used to hunt cults were now being used to join the underworld they inhabited. The fractured screen flickered to life, not with the clean and orderly interface of the BCA, but with a chaotic cascade of encrypted text, symbols, and glyphs scrolling at an impossible speed. It was the city's secret bloodstream, the flow of information between the desperate and the damned. He was a part of it now. He turned to Morrow, the orange light of the panel casting his face in stark relief, all sharp angles and deep shadows. The terror was still there, a cold stone in his gut, but it was now wrapped in a layer of cold, unbending resolve. "I'm not looking for answers anymore," he said, his voice low and raw. "I'm looking for the source, the heart of this God. I need to get to it." Morrow finished sealing the access panel and stood up, shouldering her pack. She looked at him, her headlamp beam cutting a stark line between them in the dusty air. "Going to kill God, are you, airy man?" She gave a short, mirthless laugh. "That's a special kind of contract. And the price ain't in cows, it's paid in flesh, yours." Joric met her gaze, unflinching. "I'll pay it." The echo of Kalen's voice still clawed at the air, a ghost of authority made tinny and monstrous by the district's network of cheap speakers. "Joric Kantor, designated sump-tainted, surrender for cleansing." Joric pressed himself deeper into the disused comms alcove, the cold, weeping metal a shock against his overheated skin. The niche was barely wider than his shoulders, a vertical coffin smelling of ozone and century-old rust. Condensation, thick and greasy as oil, dripped from a bundle of severed fiber-optic cables, each drop landing on the grated floor with a sound like a clicking tooth. Outside this tiny pocket of darkness, the gill racks lived on. A cacophony of groaning supports, the distant hiss of a pressure valve, and the ever-present low-frequency hum of the city's heartbeat, the sounds of a world that had just excommunicated him. Cleansing. ABC, a euphemism for a chemical bath that scoured the flesh and boiled the mind. The fate of a rabid animal. Salt rot. He squeezed his eyes shut, but the image from the cistern was burned onto the inside of his eyelids. Not Kalen's snarling face, not the approaching boots of the purity patrol he'd barely evaded. It was Silas. Silas with his serene eyes and arms plunged to the elbow in a cistern brimming with the district's filth, algae bloom, chemical runoff, human waste. Then the light. A soft fungal bloom, a web of impossible, gentle green that spread from his fingertips like cracks in ice. It was not a violent reaction. It was a quiet, inexorable claiming. The water had clarified, the stench of decay replaced by that sweet, cloying scent of honey and rot, the signature perfume of the murmuration. The damps had fallen to their knees, weeping, scooping the unblemished water into their mouths as if it were salvation itself, a mass conversion, not by sermon or threat, but by a simple, impossible act of grace.
He had stood there, a BCA observer, his diagnostic tools flickering with nonsense data. Pathogen levels dropping, heavy metals precipitating, water purity rising to A grade in less than 3 minutes. It wasn't faith. It was applied biology on a scale that defied every known law. And that was so much worse. Sump-tainted. The words were a brand. His scientific detachment, the armor he had worn for 2 decades, had been shattered. Kalen hadn't seen a quantifiable phenomenon. He'd seen a challenge to his monopoly on purity. And Joric, for not immediately calling it a parlor trick, for simply bearing witness, had been cast out. The professional debunker had become the heretic. His hand trembled as he pulled his data slate from the water-resistant pouch on his belt. The orange emergency lighting of the alcove's dead panel reflected in its dark screen, bisecting his own haggard face. His fingers, slick with grime, fumbled with the activation sequence. The familiar blue glow of the BCA interface appeared, a symbol of a life that was now over. With a few practice swipes, he bypassed the official shell, plunging into the slate's partitioned, encrypted underbelly, the place he kept his secrets. The screen shifted to a simple, text-only list. No official titles or affiliations here, just names and functions, a directory of the city's shadows he'd compiled over years of investigating the cults that festered in these lower levels. Illicit contacts, people who could get things, forge things, make people disappear. His thumb scrolled down the list, smearing the screen. Rick's info broker. No information was a luxury he could no longer afford. Cressa, black market cams. Tempting. A supply of counteragents, maybe antibiotics. But that was fighting the symptoms, not the disease. The whispering sickness inside his head chose that moment to agree. A phantom scent of rain on dry earth, a smell that hadn't existed in Benthos for a century, filled the cramped space. And with it, a whisper. Livia's whisper. "Daddy, are you lost?"
He flinched, slamming the side of his head against a sharp metal strut. Pain, white-hot and real, cut through the hallucination. He bit down on his tongue, the coppery taste of blood a welcome anchor to reality. He was not lost. He was being guided. The thought was terrifying. The spores he'd been exposed to were no longer just a subject of study. They were a co-pilot, and they were trying to seize the controls. This was no longer a BCA contract. This was an exorcism. His gaze fell back to the list on his slate, his desperation giving his search a new, feverish intensity. He needed more than a broker or a chemist. He needed to go deeper than he had ever gone before, past the gill racks, past the last of the service platforms, down into the black, drowned heart of the old world. The Bloom Deeps. The source. His thumb stopped. The entry was stark. Morocade. Sump diver. No flowery description, no list of services, just that. A title that was its own resume. Sump divers were a breed apart, half scavenger, half abyss walker. They navigated the submerged levels for old-world tech, braving structural collapses, mutated fauna, and the bloomed themselves. They were insane, suicidal, or both. They were also the only people who knew the ways down. To hire one was to admit you were leaving the sanctioned world behind entirely. It was a one-way ticket. Joric stared at the name, Morocade. He remembered the file he'd read on her once, a string of BCA violations for unauthorized salvage, a reputation for being expensive, taciturn, and utterly fearless. She had been born in the deeps, they said. She knew the currents of the drowned city like the blood in her own veins. He took a deep, shuddering breath, the air thick with the promise of his own damnation. His career was over. His life in the Eyrie was a memory. His identity had been stripped away by a single broadcast. All he had left was this burning, obsessive need to get to the core of the murmuration and rip it out by its glowing roots. To prove it was just a fungus, a mindless biological process. To prove that the face it sometimes wore, the face of his dead daughter, was just a chemical lie designed to break him. He opened a secure, anonymous message client. The blinking cursor on the blank screen seemed to mock him, asking what was left to say. He typed, his fingers moving with a grim, newfound certainty. The message was short, the new language he would have to learn to speak, the language of the desperate. Passage to the bloom deeps. Name your price. His thumb hovered over the send icon. This was it, the final irreversible step, the end of forensic theologian Joric Kantor, and the beginning of something else, something sump-tainted. He thought of Silas's smile, the beatific bliss of the converted, and Caelan's cold fury, two sides of the same counterfeit coin. He would reject them both. He would find the truth in the rot and the darkness, even if it scoured him clean. He pressed send. The message vanished. The screen went dark. He was alone again in the comms alcove, with nothing but the groan of the city and the slow, metronomic drip of water beside his head, a clock ticking down to an answer from the abyss.